Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Mr. Arni, for this wonderful introduction. I didn't know that Jairam had written so many books. I have to now buy all of them and start collecting them. And of course, it's a great honor to be on the same podium as Master Srinivasan and Nitin Pai. Mr. Jairam Ramesh probably doesn't remember, but the first time we met, Jairam, was when you were appointed officer on special duty when Narasimha Rao was made Prime Minister, and he actually facilitated my first and last interview with Narasimha Rao. He never spoke to me after that. So that was a great day. I think this book I've actually read many chapters. Some I've left out, but it's truly illuminating because it's a book that I don't think has just been edited well. Every single chapter has got something that we could learn. And it couldn't have come, I think, at a better moment, because here is the US President, I think Donald Trump, taking foreign policy to bizarre new laws, in abandoning the Syrian Kurds who had kept the IS in check for so long. He's now opened them up to the mercies of, someone who's turned foreign policy on its head also, as in the Turkish president, Erdogan. And there's also something which is interesting, which is the way that Russia has moved into the region, building ties with the so-called NATO ally, Turkey. So it is a fascinating time to examine the foreign policies of all these major powers and the smaller ones, and arriving at the conclusions that you have, that countries claim to conduct their foreign policy based on moral values and ethical principles, when in reality these claims compete with international realities and with power politics. So if we could start with you, Ambassador, we just saw this, what I call the Chennai chutney, that was created in Mahabalipuram, when much was made of Xi Jinping's visit to India. When you look back at it, he hosted the Pakistan Prime Minister the day before he landed in Chennai, and went on from here to fly straight to Kathmandu, where yes, he didn't get what he wanted. He was supposed to get a deal with the Nepalese, which would have allowed him access to the Tibetan exiles who live there, with whom he has a major problem. So, I don't know what exactly we gained from Mahabalipuram. I don't get that. In your own chapter, sir, you've talked about how Prime Minister Modi and his government's use of Hindutva bolsters India's claim to the moral high ground. But you also say that Jawaharlal Nehru's non-alignment speaks to this Indian moral superiority, which came when China invaded India in 1962. So if we could just look at these, these various points that are being made of our countries is one of high ideals and high thinking, and yet it was, to my mind, as misplaced under Nehru as it is under Modi. So the ambassador would like to open this with his comments. Following that, we can have Nitin and Jairam speaking.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Neena, thank you very much for those few words. I must say I stopped being an ambassador in 1992, so I really don't deserve that description anymore. But firstly, thank you all very much for coming. I deeply appreciate the fact that you've taken the trouble to come. I know that Bangalore presents its own challenges in getting anywhere, so my appreciation and thanks. My thanks also to Mr. Anand Arni for his introduction, and also to Mr. Ravi Chandra. And Mr. Ravi Chandra and Mr. Arni made it possible to have this event here, and I'm very grateful to them. And my thanks also, of course, to my friends, respected colleagues on the platform, Neena, Jairam, and Nitin, for agreeing to join in this discussion. Begin with an apology. I'm afraid I'm going to take quite a few minutes to try and explain the conceptual basis of this book and how really it came about. I think it's only fair for me to start with that, and then you and me would love listening to my friends on the platform for their views. I think that it really begins with my appreciation that every important country in the world considers its foreign policy is based on an estimable set of values. But though that every country in the world also is confronted by the fact that these values have to stand up to the exigencies of circumstances and the realities of international politics. We hear endlessly, tiresomely, the Americans speaking about their values, and the Europeans a little less, especially, well, except for the French and the Nordics. The Europeans are more muted on this subject. And as far as the Asians are concerned, hardly at all do they speak about values, other than for Pandit Nehru in the early days. So why is this? This is the question I started with. Why is this? Is it a question of the West against the rest? Well, there are certain reasons for this, and I thought that it'd be only appropriate for me to give some of those reasons as I see it. The first, of course, is the question of colonialism. The West had set the world agenda for some 300 years, and when countries became independent across the world, they were less inclined to accept the agenda which the West had prescribed. And particularly, they were disinclined to accept the Western view that international cooperation could only succeed under a benign Western liberal hegemony. The second issue that struck me was the question of the individual and the state. Through these revolutions, the important revolutions in the West of India, that is the American, the French, and the Russian, the aspect of the rights, freedoms, and liberties of the individual were always stressed, irrespective of the later consequences of those views. Much less importance was given to the state, whereas in Asia and the rest of the world, other than the West, the sovereignty of the state is extremely important. And under Article 2 of the United Nations, the non-interference in the internal affairs of states is stressed, and this is the issue in which the Asians take particular attention. So color revolutions and regime change are not a part of the rest's political vocabulary. The other issue that struck me was the question of secularism. In the West, religion has been placed to one side and has no direct impact on policy. Whereas in the rest, and particularly in Asia, the traditions, philosophies, and religious inheritance based on civilization plays an extremely important part in evolving the values that go into the foreign policy of Asian countries. So I would say that the Asia particularly and the whole of the rest don't necessarily share every value that's put forward as liberal and universal by the West. In fact, many of the values promoted by the West are considered to be thinly disguised means of protection. Protection for high-cost manufacturers and protection for export markets. And there is some logic in this because 80% of the rules and regulations that govern international trade and commerce were devised by the West and promoted worldwide on the backs of imperialism. But the most important feature of all, to my mind, is the question of modernity. Of course, we're all modern now, but we're all modern at different points in the chronological timetable. As the great Partha Chatterjee, the founder of the Subaltern School of History, has said, Asians are always recipients of modernity and never the architects of it. And I think the distinction is between a pre-modern Asia and a postmodern West. Yes, it's true that I think the narrative about a backward East and a progressive West has changed somewhat in recent decades. And this is partly, maybe wholly, due to the rise of the emerging economies of Asia, and particularly China. But then recent history has been all about the rise of the West. And therefore, it's very difficult for all of us to appreciate and to make that intellectual leap to consider whether any values from civilizations other than the West can have universal validity and importance. But really, frankly, it's very difficult to find any special characteristics that can be described as Asian values. The obvious distinctions are between West Asia, India, China, Japan. There's very little to find common threads going through the philosophical bases of these countries. They do have certain virtues, not values, which perhaps can be identified. And among these virtues, I would say, which are common in Asia, are respect for family, respect for ancestors, respect for hierarchy, the desire for savings, the respect for education. A very high degree of disposable family income in the whole of Asia is spent on education, and maybe responsibilities over rights, and perhaps society over the individual. So I think these virtues are important. It's very difficult to find a connection between these virtues and foreign policy directly. But I think the important point is that unlike the West, the Asians do not, or at least do not yet, try to promote these virtues or values, whatever you wish to call them, as universal and propagate them as such in the rest of the world. The conclusion really is that globalization is not likely to lead to greater democracy or political convergence. Yes, the borders of the world may become more diffuse, as they've been already in the European Union, but civilizational and cultural differences and variations are going to remain, and those are going to be critical in examining the relations between countries and the values that each country represents. Then very quickly on the book itself, it covers the Northern Hemisphere. It doesn't deal with the Southern Hemisphere because then it would run into several volumes, but the Northern Hemisphere from America to Japan. So it covers areas like Mr. Trump's America First, the values of Europe in both foreign policy and foreign economic policy, the U-turn in values in Germany and Japan after their catastrophic defeat in World War II, the values of Mr. Putin's Russia, the values of allegedly secular Indonesia and Turkey, in contrast to the allegedly religious values of Iran, the question of the values of India at the time of independence, enunciated so beautifully by Pandit Nehru, which suffered the challenges of international relations, the realities that Mr. Nehru and his successors were exposed to, and the new set of values that the present government has formulated since 2014. Some of these values now being promoted have threads, reflections of the past, but many, again, are new. Then the values of Buddhism in Myanmar and how that contributed to the Burmese neutral policy, and Confucianism in China and Japan. The book basically covers what Neena Gopal has mentioned, the tension, the inherent tension between interests and ideals. And we hope that there's something there for everybody. Anyone who's interested in which country does what and why. Again, my apologies for taking so long, but I thought I would set the scene, so to say, for the book. And like you, I'm looking forward very much to what Mr. Jairam Ramesh and Mr. Nitin Pai have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, I have no dispute with Foreign Secretary Srinivasan. He's not just Ambassador Srinivasan, he's former Foreign Secretary Srinivasan, that values are an essential underpinning of any country's foreign policy. But the question I have is, what value has values? Because it's all very well to be idealistic, to have ideals, to see the world the way we want the world to be. But unfortunately, the real world is somewhat different. I mean, there is the tension between the way we see the world and the way the world actually is. So, in a way, I think the real question to ask is, do values have any value in the formulation of foreign policy? Or is foreign policy purely an instrument of domestic policy, of domestic political policy, domestic economic policy, domestic cultural policy? And I would tend to argue that in India, particularly since we are discussing it in India, that there has been far more continuity than we often give credit for. There have been shifts in priorities, no doubt. And I think, broadly speaking, there was a Nehruvian policy which was an outcome of the freedom movement. It was not Mr. Nehru articulated it, but I think there was a far greater degree of consensus during the freedom movement on what the foreign policy of an independent India should be. And we followed that policy. I think in 91 marks a sharp departure from the Nehruvian consensus. And I think, if for want of a better word, there is a Narsim Ravian, Manmohan Singhian policy, value of foreign policy, which is that ultimately economics trumps everything. You can have all your Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam and all this stuff, which is all very well, but ultimately it's 8% economic growth that counts, and that really should be the only value. So I would argue that in 91, India moved from a idealistic foreign policy to a more instrumentalist foreign policy, to looking at foreign policy as something that would support domestic economic transformation. And I agree with Mr. Srinivasan that 2014 marks yet another discontinuity. Although ideals remain, economic transformation remained, but there is, since 2014, certainly a greater cultural and a greater, for want of a better word, civilizational content to our foreign policy. So there is change, there has been change over the last 70 years, but there has been an underlying stratum of continuity as well. We can discuss what those changes are, but broadly my reaction, to reading this book is that, first of all, I think it's a very rare collection, very rare anthology, where countries' values that animate foreign policy of different countries and different continents are brought together by scholars, and so therefore there's a lot of value to this. To what extent each country practices these values, of course, is something debatable. There is always a gap between what a country professes as what its foreign policy is and what a country actually follows as its foreign policy. But on the whole, I found the anthology, very, very educative, and it's one of the very few collections which really look at the world in its diversity. Most of foreign policy works relate to the Western countries. There's a classic work of Walter Russell Mead called Special Providence, which looks at American foreign policy, and he talks about the Jeffersonian, the Hamiltonian, the Wilsonian, and the Jacksonian strands of American foreign policy. Similarly, there have been books on Britain and a few works on Europe, but never before have I seen an anthology which looks at Iran, Turkey, China, India, as part of an overall framework. So I want to congratulate Mr. Srinivasan for this effort. It's really a remarkable effort, and I think it educates us on what the idealistic roots of a country's foreign policy are. But whether they're actually followed or not is something that we can discuss.
Yeah, Nitin.
Yeah, I think first of all about the book, absolutely agree with you. It's a fantastic book, and any student of international relations and foreign policy must read this book. Right? So it reaches that status because of the diversity of opinions, the countries that are represented there. I mean, there was a chapter on Myanmar, how Myanmar looks at values and foreign policy. That's such a rare kind of a paper. You don't find these this kind of literature in international relations textbooks. So those of us who are interested in studying international relations, I think must keep this book as a reference in the bookshelf. Right? Now, as far as the question which you posed goes and some of the themes in this book goes, I must confess I come from a very different school of thought. In international relations, I would look at the scene. I'm persuaded by realism, which means power matters more than anything else. It overshadows almost everything else. And in the domestic scene, within the context of a constitutional republic in a domestic country, values matter a lot. We construct a domestic politics on a bedrock of values which animate our constitution, which gives us rule of law, and the texture of the rule of law. All of that is determined by values. But in international relations, certainly not. I just want to read out a few things, rather than put up my own words. I just want to read out a few things, some of which are in the book and some of which are not, and then put a little bit of commentary in the middle, right? I first read Hans Morgenthau, right? This guy is the father of international relations scholars, and this is what he says about ideologies, right? So ideologies, values. While all politics is necessarily the pursuit of power, ideologies render involvement in that contest for power psychologically and morally acceptable to the actors and their audience. So it's both to the actors and the audience. Ideologies are either ultimate goals of political action or pretexts and false fronts behind which the element of power inherent in all politics is concealed. They may fulfill one or the other function, or they may fulfill both at the same time. And now this is the punchline. The nation that dispensed with ideologies and frankly stated that it wanted power would find itself at a great and perhaps decisive disadvantage in the struggle for power. So I look at Nehru as a realist in this sense. Here you are in 1947, a very poor country, large but poor country, but wants to have its own in the Committee of Nations, and you pull out moral power, you talk about non-alignment, you talk about, moral values, etc., which gives you that kind of weight in international relations. And I think India under Nehru certainly, in the early parts of the Nehru government, certainly punched above its weight in international relations, right? And you used values essentially as a form of power. This value versus interest thing is a very age-old debate. You would see this if you read the Mahabharata, it's there. You read the Gita, it's there. And at any point, you know, foreign policy is this quest of, do you let your values talk or do you let your interests talk, right? So this debate has been going on. But I want to read a couple of passages from the book, interesting ones. The first one is I read Palmerston, right? Palmerston was writing in the early 19th century, right? Early 18th. Yeah. So it's a long one, but I'll try and read the shorter one. I hold that the real policy of England is to be the champion of justice and right, pursuing that course with moderation and prudence, not becoming the Quixote of the world, but giving the weight of her moral sanction and support wherever she thinks that justice is, and wherever she thinks that wrong has been done. Okay, so there's a lot of sentences. And then he says, we have no eternal allies and we have no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and those interests it is our duty to follow. So he starts this paragraph by talking about values and fighting for justice and what is right. And he ends the paragraph by talking about we need to follow our interests because there are no perpetual friends and enemies, right? So that two-sidedness, that dilemma is captured in this one sentence. You start off by talking about values, you end up talking about interests. There's another one, which is a shorter one, where I quote Eisenhower. Eisenhower says, the vast majority of Americans of both parties know that to keep their nation free, they bear a majestic responsibility for freedom all through the world. So he's talking about, you know, to protect your own freedom, you need to, fight for freedoms around the world. So this debate of, what has to take precedence is a continuous one. But what actually determines what happens? And I think the answer is power, right? Because even if you talk about interests, India's national interests, United States national interests, what are they, right? Initially, you would say survival and security is the primary interest. Everybody has to survive, maintain their independence. But beyond that, okay, now that we are free, now that we are going to protect ourselves against our external enemies, what are our interests? You said 8% growth, right? It's a defined thing. It's a social construct. So power determines what interests, how you define your interests, and therefore what interests you follow. And power also determines what values you profess. So the values which Nehru professed or Rao professed and now Modi professed are different. And they're able to change that definition of value because they are in power. So I think if you take that view that power is this great intermediary variable which determines all of that, we get some more explanatory value in terms of why people do what they do, why countries do what they do. Now, I want to end with an interesting question. If we believe that power is going to be an important, believe me for a moment. Let's say power is an important variable which determines this. The question is, what happens to Indian foreign policy as we become more powerful? And then if we believe that economic power, 8% growth, well, no more, 8% growth, whatever it is now. Minus. I don't know what that is now. It's low single digits. Let's say growth accumulates over a period of time and India becomes richer and therefore more powerful over a period of time. How is our behavior going to change, right? I see two variables there. Wealth is, of course, going to be a determinant because I think there's a sort of a non-linear trajectory to how rich people behave, right? As you get richer, from being desperately poor to middle class, you're more interested in the material part of it, right? You want to pursue growth, you want to pursue the national interest in its very raw form. But once you reach a certain level of wealth, let's say per capita income becomes $40,000, right? But now we're at 2,000. Let's say at $40,000 or more, you might be interested in the finer things in life, about culture, civilization, values, want to save the poor people of the world, want to do things for others, want to save, spread freedom around, other parts of the world, and define your interests as such, as the United States did. So that's one thing. So we might be in a period where we will be nakedly pursuing power in the next 10, 20 years, and beyond that we might be more interested in the wonderful things of life. But the other variable there is demographics, right? Do we think that people in their 20s will be interested in values in foreign policy? I doubt that, right? And half the population of India is below the age of 27. So until people get older, I think we will not be so interested in promoting values. We might be interested in talking about values, but promoting and acting on those values in foreign policy, I think it's a little doubtful. That's my take, right?
No, I think you've summed up the millennial pretty well. I think
The
they are.
only thing that will count in foreign policy in future is visas, not foreign
The
policy.
future is?
I mean, visas. I mean, visas will be the single most important factor determining India's foreign policy. A younger population, demographics are going to be such, and the job situation is going to be such that you will be judged by how many visas you're going to actually be able to extract as a result of your foreign policy.
Well, the government of India has just issued a travel advisory saying don't travel to Turkey. So I don't know where that leaves us on the. No, I just want to say I think the argument between realpolitik and values is actually if that were the realpolitik wills out every time, then Trump is a master. He's not the bumbling idiot that we all think he is. That his tweet diplomacy is what everyone trashes. But in fact, the man is looking at U.S. interests vis-a-vis Afghanistan, where he's pulled out his 2,000 troops and is very cleverly doing side talks with the Taliban without going public. And in Syria and Turkey, he's doing the same thing. He's pulled out the troops because he's got to win elections. And for him, at the bottom of his top of his list of priorities is to win 2020. So he would then be a master diplomat. Don't you agree?
Well, that presumes that you see some method in that madness, right? There is some method in some parts of the madness, but not always, right? But if you look at it as aggregate, has American power increased or receded during his tenure? I think it's receded.
Yeah.
Right? So if you use that as a metric of his performance, then he's actually let his country down because power has receded.
Yeah, he's no longer the leader of the free world, that's for sure. He's ceded that power to even Putin, for that matter, because Putin has, taking Crimea, and doing what he's done now in Syria and stepping in and seeing to it that the buffer zone is his responsibility, I think has shown that he means business and he's reaching out to China. If one of you guys could actually talk about China, I think it would be very interesting. I think the rise of Xi and the effect that you brought up Myanmar, which I think is fascinating because in Myanmar, you have the Rohingyas being ethnically cleansed and rushed out of Rakhine and pushed into, Cox's Bazar. And the Bangladeshis themselves are now pushing them into an island, apparently, where, they'll be open to the elements. There's no protection for them there either. India has not spoken out on India's foreign policy, which is no longer Nehruvian. Modi has not spoken out publicly about this. He's not raised the issue with Bangladesh. He has not raised the issue with Myanmar. Is it because he fears that China, which is slowly and steadily encircling India, has got Myanmar in its pocket? And the other issue which I found interesting was the fact that by mid-November, we could have a government in Colombo which is definitely anti-India, because it will possibly see the return of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, whose brother, under his brother Mahinda, virtually gifted Colombo and his own hometown of Hambantota to the Chinese. So, you can see the creeping power of China, and you've talked about RCEP, Jairam. There was an interview in today's Hindu with a former US ambassador to India who said that if we sign that and if we give Huawei a step into India, we would then be working our way out of the Western alliance. So, it'd be interesting to see how China has played this whole game. You know, they have appealed to they've basically taken over Pakistan virtually and seem to be funding Pakistan to a great extent. And so where does that leave us? Because we are then left scrambling because we are losing control of our eastern seaboard and our western, area. Because Iran is also not.
I don't think the situation is as grim as you make it out to be. Rajapaksa's pocket might be with the Chinese, but his head and his heart is still with Puttaparthi and Tirupati. I can tell you that the Sri Lankan leadership goes to the Chinese for the bucks, but they look to India for culture, for spirituality, for solace, for marriages. There's a split personality in many of these neighboring countries of ours, including Bangladesh, for example.
And the Maldives.
Including Bangladesh, including Nepal. So Nepal also looks to China for building highways and infrastructure investment, but when it comes to jobs, when it comes to the soft power, they look to India. So I don't think that we should be. Sure. The Chinese are establishing bridgeheads in our neighboring countries, and that's something that we should be concerned about. I can tell you, having dealt with Myanmar for many years, there has been a backlash to Chinese expansionism in Myanmar. And there was a time when Myanmar actually looked to India as a counterweight to China. In fact,
they did cancel the Mysore Dam.
In fact, I was the minister in waiting for Aung San Suu Kyi. When she came to Bangalore. She spent a day here in Bangalore, and during the trip during the travel time that we had from Delhi to Bangalore, she was telling me that she was worried about growing Chinese presence, and she looked to India to have a larger presence as a counterweight to China. So it's not. I wouldn't paint a doomsday scenario that the Chinese are taking over the Indian neighborhood and that India is being elbowed out. That's not true. I think we still have a lot of capital. We can't compete with the Chinese when it comes to big bucks, to signing multi-billion-dollar lines of credit. But there are other advantages that we have. We have the soft power, we have education, we have training, we have human capital. And I can tell you that no politician in our neighborhood goes to China for medical treatment. They all come to India for medical treatment. So there are certain natural advantages that India has. The soft power of India is very, very strong.
That's true.
Very strong.
In Beijing, they sing you songs in Hindi when they see you.
I was in Angola some years ago, where I was commerce minister. We just couldn't compete with the Chinese when it came to lines of credit. We were giving $500 million line of credit. The Chinese line of credit was $10 billion. But every Angolan I spoke to wanted to come to India to study. They wanted to come to Bangalore to get an engineering college. They wanted a medical college. That's all that they wanted. True. So there are advantages that India has that we should leverage. We can compete. This Me Tooism in foreign policy is not going to lead us very far because the Chinese are simply their ability to mobilize billions of dollars. You can see it in Afghanistan. But there are critical elements of Afghanistan's infrastructure, human capital infrastructure, which India has contributed much more than the Chinese. So we should recognize our strengths. I think that's the point that Mr. Srinivasan also has made in the book, that you recognize your strengths, you build on those strengths, and you don't have to imitate or replicate what the Chinese are doing.
So you're basically saying that India shouldn't compete directly with China on the projects and work to our strengths, which is our soft power.
Yeah, we have strengths which the Chinese don't have. I think the Chinese, for us to go and compete with the Chinese on some of these projects, we are just not going to be successful. For example, in a line of credit, the Chinese can decide who will get the project. and how it will be executed. We can't do it in this country. We'll have CVC, we have CBI, we have the CAG, we have Parliament, we have media, all sorts of questions we're going to, and thank God for that. I mean, after all, domestic politics determines the shape of your foreign policy. And there are advantages in India. We're an open society, we're a free society. People question, and they should be questioning.
Mr. Srinivasan, you wanted to say something?
Well, I think we've got drawn into India, China here, and that's okay. I think that we need to address this question since you've raised it. It's not a question of values, except perhaps subliminally. China, in the last 20, 25 years, has made, as everybody knows, increased its prowess to such a great extent in such a short time in the whole of history. Naturally, it's taken many of the other countries in the world, not only by surprise, but perhaps it's put them on the back foot. And I think that the world has to come to terms with a very powerful China. Nothing that India is going to do, no sanctions that the United States is going to take against Chinese export or intellectual property is going to halt that rise. I think that in the process of adjustment, we have to reckon with China's core interests, as they put it. China's identified 2 or 3 slogans, if you like, which represent their foreign policy at the moment. One is the mutuality of core interests, that is to say, you respect their core interests and they respect yours. The second is a new form of great power relationship. That is, they were speaking specifically about the United States, but basically, again, it was a rehash of, you could say, the 5 principles, but brought up to date. And thirdly, they have made it clear that their priority is the peripheral, the border diplomacy. This has been China's forte throughout the centuries. What you're seeing in South Asia at the moment, in South China Sea, in the ASEAN countries, and even China-Russia relations, is the strong affirmation of China's peripheral policy. Certainly, they don't want to have a clash with the United States, which they think will impede their rise. So somehow those frictions will get absorbed into a different form of bilateral relationship with America. But in terms of South Asia, which you mentioned, and so on, this is the strong assertion of China's peripheral policy. And I entirely agree that we have our liabilities, but we also have our strengths. If we play to our strengths, I think that those are strengths which very few other countries can match. Many of these strengths are in terms of our ability to give non-reciprocal, non-leveraged technical assistance, educational assistance, medical assistance, and these are completely without strings. We have given some very modest lines of credit to various countries. I think the biggest recipient now perhaps is Bangladesh, and these are without any strings attached. So when the leaders of our neighborhood, whether it's in Bangladesh or Sri Lanka or Maldives, come to reckon with the profit and loss account of dealing with China, they have to take that into consideration. So I think that by and large, I just sum up the India-China relationship with my own sentiment that the only way of really checking China's rise, which is still taking place and will still take maybe 20 or 30 years to fructify completely, I think the only way to deal with this is multilateralism. You have to absorb China into a network of much more complex multilateral relationships than exist today. We had some glimmer of that, I think, during the environmental talks when China and India worked very closely together. We've had that sporadically in the WTO, where India and China also have worked together, mainly, I must say, to protect the differentiated status of India and China as developing countries, which I think is highly questionable. But anyway, we have worked together on that. And there are such things which have been helpful in blunting this acrimony and animosity. Animosity which is derived, actually, as the Chinese say correctly, from history. I mean, the border is a dispute which has been handed down to us by imperialism. And I think that this has left such a tremendous scar on India that it's very hard for us to now see a situation where we can compromise or where we can at least go some way forward in resolving this question. But this is not really a question of our own making, and it's not really a question of China's making. These are boundaries which were drawn by imperialism, very ambiguous boundaries indeed when you consider it both to the west of India and to the northeast of India. And I think the sooner we recognize that these are fungible questions, these are not set in stone, and they are subject to amicable bilateral negotiation, the better. Coming back to multilateralism, as you perhaps hinted, and I would agree, Mr. Trump has turned his back on multilateralism. It's a great disfavor to the international community. The United Nations gets very short shrift from Mr. Trump. If he gets a second term, that is going to continue. The Americans and the Europeans are greatly responsible for not giving China its due role in multilateral financial institutions. You'll be surprised to hear probably that China has less voting strength than Europeans in IMF and the World Bank. And this is a preposterous situation. It doesn't represent current reality. So I think that in short, bilaterally, I think that you have huge assets with China, and you do not necessarily have to feel that you are being encircled or trampled upon or in some way diminished by China because you have tremendous assets. Secondly, I would say that on the multilateral field, I hope that the day will come when some genuine multilateralism takes place which can embrace China also and then make them a responsible member of the international community. I think that day is a little far off, but I'm still hopeful that it's possible.
What about China using Pakistan as a proxy? Now with the Belt and Road, that project which is there, that is utterly Chinese pragmatism. As you say in Angola, people may love you, but ultimately at the end of the day, in all of these countries, it's China that builds the roads, builds the parliament. And in Pakistan, for example, Imran Khan, his very strange, offer of mediating between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which all of these years they circled around each other. But now with Iran propping up the Houthis in Yemen, and those two incredible attacks on oil installations in Saudi Arabia, I think Saudi Arabia itself realized that it cannot have this war. It can't protect itself from drone attacks. But do you actually think that Imran Khan could rise using, on the back of this Islamic foreign policy, the cover of Islam, as being the person who could, maybe even overshadow, maybe step in where nobody else has gone before?
Well, while you're asking me this question, I was trying to relate this. How do I answer this question in the context of values in foreign policy, right? And here's how I would look. Look, if China and Pakistan have this wonderful, deep as the ocean, high as the mountain kind of relationship, it was all okay when it was long distance, right? And now they're just not long distance; they're just in very close proximity to each other physically, right? How is this going to play out in value? If they were to insist on their values in this interaction with each other, this thing is going to go explode, right? I mean, a Chinese man can't live a day without eating some part of a pig.
That's true.
Right? And
neither can the Filipinos.
Yeah, I mean, it's the pig is to the Chinese what white rice is to South Indians, right? So, and now you're in this country where how are you going to eat, right? So I wish
There are
them.
12,000 Chinese.
I wish that the CPEC becomes a more closer relationship. More Chinese live and work in Pakistan and express their national values and their civilizational values. It's going to be very good for us.
You know, Aisha Jalal, Pakistani scholar, I just asked her one day, what do you think of this Belt and Road Initiative? And she said, you know, this is the best thing that could happen to Pakistan. More Chinese in Pakistan means less mullahs from Saudi Arabia. And she then went on to explain to me the point that you're making, that greater engagement with China will mean that Pakistan will become more economy-oriented, more, growth-oriented than looking only to Iran and Saudi Arabia. Whether it'll happen or not is a separate issue. But I agree entirely with Nitin that actually engagement with China might be good in the long run as far as Pakistan is concerned. But I want to take one point of Mr. Srinivasan in his chapter, and just raise this issue with him. There is a lot of continuity in our foreign policy over the last 50, 60 years. Whatever the rhetoric may be, there is far greater continuity in economic policy. But there are some sharp differences, some sharp shifts that have taken place. And I want to raise one or two sharp shifts that have taken place in the post-2014 era and ask both of them to comment on this. One, the role of overseas Indians, the diaspora. Jawaharlal Nehru went to Nairobi in 1955. Mr. Srinivasan will remember this very well. He goes to Nairobi in 1955. The height of the African agitation against Indian domination in Kenya. And Mr. Nehru tells the Indians in Kenya, you have to make up your mind whether you're Kenyans or whether you're Indians. You're living in Kenya. I don't care whether you're a Tamilian or a Gujarati or whatever, Hindu or Muslim, you are a Kenyan. Mr. Nehru says this in 1955. Mr. Modi is not saying that. And to be fair, Ms. Indira Gandhi, VP Singh, Gujral, Narasimha Rao, Manmohan Singh, Atal Bihari Vajpayee all followed that line. Since 2014, an Indian living abroad is an instrument of India's domestic policy. Do you agree?
I do. I think it is a fact that these meetings of Indians overseas are not. It didn't start with Mr. Modi, as you well know. We had this under Morarji Desai, we had this under Indira Gandhi, etc., Rajiv Gandhi, and so on. So this was nothing new. But the scope of these meetings, the scale of these meetings, and the rhetoric in these meetings have really been to rouse the Indians abroad to be hyper-patriotic as Indians and not to see their country of their adoption as their native home, which is what Mr. Nehru had propagated.
Yeah, I think Nehru did that in Singapore as well, when he was talking to the Indians in the Strait settlements of that time. But you see, this thing, what we are doing with the politicization of ethnic Indians around the world is extremely dangerous. It's extremely dangerous for them, who are diaspora Indians, maybe ethnic Indians abroad, and it's dangerous for us.
I agree.
Right? It's dangerous for them because imagine Sheikh Hasina comes to Bangalore, and you have 20,000 Bangladeshis in Chinnaswamy Stadium in an event like that. How are we going to see the Bangladeshis, right? It's the same kind of a reaction happens to the Indians living abroad. And so far, the Indians, in contrast to the Chinese, expatriate Indians around the world, have been seen as loyal citizens of the country. You've had army chiefs in Singapore, you have presidents in Singapore who've been ethnic Indians, you have ministers, cabinet ministers in many countries, and they are proud patriots of the country which they belong to.
Portuguese Prime Minister.
And there's no doubt about their loyalties, right? Lee Kuan Yew used to feel that the Indians in Singapore are more loyal to Singapore than the Chinese, right? So, because there was no question about their loyalty, either in the elite segments or in the popular segments, they were highly successful. You wouldn't be attacked, you wouldn't be, you wouldn't be the receiving ends of populist and nationalist backlashes. Now we've exposed Indians for the first time in many, many years, maybe in decades, to this kind of a backlash. So what we've seen in the last few years is just the first half of the movie. The second half of this movie is going to be extremely dangerous. The second is, it's also going to reflect badly on us. Because one of the reasons, if you look around, there's a lot of official pushback against the People's Republic of China because governments see their nationals or ethnic Chinese as intruding into domestic politics of those countries. So China is seen as this, bad guy because of these actions. And they're going to see the same. I mean, if the Indians are interfering in our domestic politics, we have to look at the Indians in a different light, right? So that's one side of it. But there are also other parts. There are asymmetric obligations that we've incurred. It's all very nice to go to Jamaica or Fiji and, when everything is hunky-dory and say, hey, Mother India is ready for you. Please come to the atrocious thing which we used to have, Ministry of Overseas Indians, right? And it had no business existing, but we persisted with it for many, many years and said, please come to this wonderful day. And we, well, that's called the United Nations. But now, if things go belly up, are we prepared to go and intervene in a riot in Fiji? Are we prepared to go into Trinidad and Tobago and rescue the Indians there? Or indeed in the United States, if there are, if there's a big backlash against the Indians there, are we prepared to, use force? Do we have the capability to do that? Right? So, but we've already incurred that obligation, right? There is an implicit obligation now that Mother India is ready to rescue you should some nasty things happen to you, because you are with us in the good times, so we are going to be with you in the bad times as well. And I don't think we have the capacity, nor have we been thinking about these things. So it's a very dangerous situation that
Although we did step in during the Gulf crisis in the first Gulf War, where all these hundreds of Indians were stranded in Saudi Arabia, and we did go to their rescue. I remember covering that.
They were Indian citizens. They were Indian citizens. We rescued Indian citizens.
They were not citizens of the Gulf.
Immigrant workers.
They were still our people. And I still think that the government of India has a responsibility to help an Indian citizen in distress any part of the world, right? Especially if it's not due to the person's own making. But if you're a ethnic Indian who is a Singapore citizen or you're a US citizen, I don't think the government of India has any obligation towards you.
I wrote this biography of P.N. Huxer recently, and one of the chapters in that book is Huxer, who is this great Nehruvian. He's a, Nehru Bhakt, extremely critical of the Nehru-Liaquat Pact of 1950. Why? And he writes to Indira Gandhi a note saying that I yield to no one in my admiration for Nehru, but Nehru made a blunder on the Nehru-Liaquat Pact in April 1950, because what the Nehru-Liaquat Pact did was to say that the responsibility for protecting Hindus in Pakistan is that of India, and the responsibility for protecting Muslims in India is that of Pakistan. And he said that the responsibility for protecting Muslims in India is that of the Indian government, and the responsibility for protecting Hindus in Pakistan, that time both West and East, is that of the Pakistan government. I think that policy should remain. It's a value. That's an immutable, constant value. But that value has changed. It's changed in the last 5 years. And I think, we are seeing the short-term benefits, but there are long-term costs that are not yet apparent. The short-term benefits are very, very apparent. But it is, to take Mr. Srinivasan's chapter, the last section of his chapter, it's a major paradigm shift that has taken place in the values of Indian foreign policy.
You were going to say there's 2 points. You mentioned the first one. What's the second one?
No, the second one is on the projection of India, the projection of Indian power. The projection of Indian power is, this whole civilizational angle.
Yes.
nothing irritates the East Asians more than to be told about civilizational links with India. And nothing irritates them more. But I think it was muted in the last few years. But if you see post-2014, this civilizational discourse, the civilizational element, what that civilizational element is, is undefined. But this projection of India in East Asia, in Africa, in Central Asia, is now assuming not just an economic dimension or a political dimension, which it has always had, but it is being looked at in civilizational terms. And that again, we don't know how that's going to play out. Because it plays out very well domestically, it may not necessarily play out well in Vietnam or Cambodia or Laos or Uzbekistan. I don't know what Mr. Srinivasan thinks, but I think there is a dichotomy here.
Should we throw it open to questions? Yeah? We could start with, I'll ask Pranay to prepare a question. Pranay, could we start with you?
You planted a question.
He asked me a question which he wanted asked.
So, my question is related to power legitimacy. So, on most determinants of power, I think US power far exceeds that of China. So, you take any important determinant of power, right? But if anything is declining more rapidly, it is the legitimacy element of US rather than the power element of it. So, I just wanted to know, do you agree with this formulation? It's a question to all three of you. And what do you think would be the consequences of this if legitimacy of US declines while its power still remains high?
Who is this question addressed to?
I think all of us would have a view on this, but this is going to be the strange paradox of the next 20 or 30 years. By 2030, it's expected that China will overtake the United States as far as GDP is concerned. That is nominal GDP. And to that extent, the Chinese become the most powerful economic country in the world by that yardstick. At the same time, the United States will continue indefinitely to be the most powerful military country in the world. They have bases in, umpteen countries. They have intelligence organizations in numerous countries also. They are able to project power across the world at the moment. I don't think there's any other country in the next, up to 2050, I don't see any other country being able to match this. So you have this dichotomy, this strange mismatch of the most powerful economic country and the most powerful military country, and yet I'm perfectly convinced that both countries will try their best to avoid conflict other than by accident. That accident could take place, I think not with Iran, not with Yemen, not with Saudi Arabia, not certainly, I think, in Eastern Europe, but I think North Korea might be a difficult situation for both countries to manage. But answering your question, I think we're going to face this awkward reality of two extremely powerful countries in the world, far outstripping all their rivals, with one economic and one military.
Well, I think it's very easy to write the epitaph of the United States, but I think it's too premature to write the epitaph because you're comparing two countries, one with a per capita income of $10,000 with another with a per capita income of $50,000. That gap is not going to reduce, even though China will be the largest economy in the world. In per capita terms, America will be at least 4 times far more powerful than the Chinese. Second, which is often forgotten in these discussions, China will become old before it becomes rich. America will continue to be young. The median age in China is going to increase in the next 25 years, but the median age in the US does not increase as dramatically simply because of the immigration stream that is available to the Americans, which is not available to China. So the US really has a lot of strengths. And those strengths are not going to vanish in addition to the military strengths, which Mr. Srinivasan just enumerated. Those strengths are not going to vanish.
Just another.
But it will be a G2, no doubt about it. Let's be very clear. It is a G2 world. And one of the Gs is our neighbor. So we have to adjust to the fact that across the Himalayas we have the second pole of this bipolar world. But it's, I think, to say that America is going to decline dramatically and the Chinese are going to fill this void, I think it's too premature to say that.
Well, I think I'll just add a footnote to that. I think America is also going to change demographically, because I think in, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 years' time, it's predicted that it will not be a white country anymore. What implication, consequence that will have, nobody can tell right now.
What legitimacy, Pranay? Who accepted the US legitimacy ever, right? So I think the beyond a bubble where we believe that there's an international community and the actions of the United States enjoyed legitimacy, I think that legitimacy was not really accepted by anybody. What was accepted is the fact that you had to do their bidding because they were powerful, right? And if you're a small country, what you would prefer is a balance of power to be in your in a particular international context, or maybe the global context, such that you have rules-based behavior. But the reason they preferred rules-based behavior is because otherwise they get pushed around, right? But if there's no balance of power, then in the post-Cold War, immediate years of the post-Cold War, you just had one huge global hegemon, and it professed a certain set of values, and whether you liked it or not, you just had to comply. So I don't think legitimacy was ever there beyond the minds of people who thought there was legitimacy.
Yeah, so, second row.
My question is open to the panelists. So today, trade deficit between India and China is over 50 billion USD, and India is making attempts to attract investments and encourage exports to China to bring the deficit down. Certainly, China will expect equal favor from India, such as allowing Huawei to participate in 5G. Given US has put restrictions on several Chinese companies, therefore, how India will navigate through to ensure the relationship with US is not compromised? Thank you.
Who's this addressed to?
Yes.
Question very well.
I didn't, I'm sorry, it went too fast for me. What exactly, could you just summarize it a little bit?
Sure. Well, as you know, today between India and China, there's a trade deficit over 50 billion USD. And India is making several attempts to attract investments in China and also export to China. But certainly China also will expect equal favor from India, such as allowing companies such as Huawei to participate in 5G in India. Now, given US has laid several restrictions on many Chinese companies, how India will navigate through this to ensuring that...
Okay, I've got it. Of course, I think Mr. Ramesh knows much more about this than I do, because he's dealt with international exchanges much more than I have. But I'd say this. I think that it's not correct to take bilateral trade imbalances as a criterion. I think what you need to do is to take a global, the global plus or minus account, and not castigate individual countries for having a credit balance with us. Let's not forget that all the countries in our neighborhood are countries with whom we have a credit balance other than Myanmar and China. So the boot then is on the other foot. They can have equal grievance against us. So, this is not, I think, the right way of looking at it. Whether it's 50 billion or whether it's 10 billion or whatever, I don't think that's the right way of looking at it. We have a global trade deficit. That is what should be looked at, and looked at pretty urgently, in my view. Yes, of course, we should try to expand our exports. We should try and expand opportunities for investment in China. And we should try and break down any Chinese resistance to these things. But again, let's not think that we're angels in this. there are tremendous restrictions on the Chinese coming here. I think this is where Mr. Ramesh knows much more than I do about this. They have great difficulties in getting visas, irrespective of whatever decisions are made by our leaders. They have great difficulties in investment in India. I think there's a very strong anti-Chinese sentiment in certain circles in Delhi, which really surprised me, I must say. And in regard to Huawei, I mean, if you consider that Germans can accept Huawei, and if you consider that the British can accept Huawei, I'm not quite sure what the problem is for us to accept Huawei. Do we want to be left behind in 5G? This is going to be perhaps the most important game changer in telecommunications in the world, or artificial intelligence in the world, and this is something we don't want to miss out on.
And even though Huawei has a development center in Bangalore.
No, yes.
You are absolutely right, Mr. Srinivasan. You know, if you have this discussion in Kathmandu, Dhaka, or Colombo, the only question that you will get is, but India is having such a huge trade surplus, and we are having such a huge trade deficit. So this exactly the same debate takes place in our neighboring countries. And when we go to our neighboring countries, we have only one mantra. We tell them, you allow Indian companies to invest in your countries, and automatically the trade deficit will vanish. But we are not prepared to implement the same mantra when it comes to China. So we have, you know, one of the values which probably is intrinsic to the Indian psyche in foreign policy is double standards. We haven't talked about that. But this is, I mean, it's true of all countries, but I suppose, but it's more marked in our case. But the fact is that you're right, we have enormous restrictions on Chinese investment in India. They can't invest in border states, they can't invest in strategic areas. There are many, many ifs and buts when it comes to Chinese investment. And I think if we are serious of what we mean when we talk to Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bhutan, or Bangladesh, then we should be equally serious in implementing that advice vis-a-vis China.
I have a very different view on this. I am, you know, a strong believer in free trade. I'm a strong believer in competitive markets, free trade, the WTO, globalization, etc. But what you have with China is not free trade, and for a few reasons. There's no way of knowing where a private Chinese company ends and where the Communist Party of China begins, right? Which means the player you have on the other side has endowments and competitive advantages which you don't have. You know, whether it's access to cheap loans, access to a playing field which is not quite level in the home market, and all of that, right? So of course you could argue that, oh yeah, so what? You know, they are producing goods at very low costs. The Chinese taxpayer is subsidizing these goods, and we're getting low cost modems subsidized by the Chinese people. So let's say thank you to them, right? Which is an argument, right? Which is an argument. If the Chinese are subsidizing our modems and phones, why not? But competitively, you're not dealing with Cisco, for example. You know, if a US company is playing in a free market, in a ruthless competitive market, the Chinese company is not. Second, the Chinese way of censoring information, erecting the Great Wall, the Great Firewall, right, means, you know, the justification is that we want to protect our people from foreign influences. Okay, that's your domestic policy. It's fine. You could do whatever you like, censor whatever you like, because that's your business. But the firewall is also a trade barrier to information businesses. Sitting here in Bangalore, I wonder, look, if Bangalore companies want to do business in China, in the information space, in the broad technology space, you're blocked, right? Facebook is blocked, and you know, you just have your national champion. Your WhatsApp is blocked, and if we were to create an Indian company which does that, it's blocked. But we don't block TikTok, we don't block WeChat and other things. So it's not a level playing field, right? So the information policies of the Chinese government are trade barriers to the information industry which we have. Now, question of Huawei, right? I used to be in the telecoms business. I used to be a telecoms regulator at one point in time. So I know a little bit more about this than the others, okay? The first news is that, well, ever since the first submarine cable was laid, 120 years ago, governments have been snooping on phone calls and messages, right? All governments have been doing it. It's nothing new, right? Now, what China is trying to do is doing this at a scale that is unprecedented, okay? So United States, if I were in the United States government, in the security agencies, and if I didn't have backdoors into equipment which the US manufacturers are selling, I should be fired, right? So I'm sure there are people in the NSA and the other agents in the US who are trying to find backdoors and installing equipment in India which can spy on Indians. The Israelis are probably doing it. The Germans are probably doing it. The Japanese are probably doing it. If they're not doing it, someone needs to lose a job, right? But the only people we have a dispute with is China. So I'm okay if the NSA reads my email, but I'm not okay if the People's Republic of China reads my email, because I have a problem with him, right? So I think that's the reason I would think that you need to have a greater control on what, on what you do with Chinese manufacturers, especially with 5G, because it's a generational changeover of the internet. It's not a linear change. It's a step function change in how the internet functions. And you don't want to give away things too early without knowing what you're getting into. I mean, you can always keep them out, and 10 years later you can bring them in if everything is safe. Now, I want to end with one thing, and this is what both the speakers said. You can have Chinese investments in India. You could offer, for example, why don't the Chinese bankroll the development of our highways, of bridges, of ports, right? This is dumb infrastructure. This is brick and concrete, right? Build apartment complexes, build low-cost housing, right? Get a low rate of return which will be sustainable over a long period of time. It works for the Chinese because they're spending $1 trillion in stupid countries on the, what's that called, the Belt and Road things, right? You're spending $1 trillion in, godforsaken countries. They're not going to get the return anyway. So at least you invest in India, at least you can recover some of your money, right? So there is a win-win with China in infrastructure investments, in certain types of investments, in buying low-cost modems for our homes and offices. All that is fine. But in core equipment, core telecoms equipment, security equipment, like what the government uses or with corporate use, and the core networks, no.
You wanted to say something?
Well, I might have some observations to make on that last point, but I don't think we need to get into a dialogue on that. I think there are definite restrictions on Chinese investment in India, even in infrastructure projects, building projects, etc., that there are enormous handicaps for them to work in India.
Well, I have one specific question to Mr. Ramesh that I will come later, but two comments. At the beginning, when you said the title of the book is specifically related to Northern Hemisphere, that was shocking to me. Does it mean that Southern Hemisphere did not exist in your mind? Number one. Number two, I agree completely with what you said about Nehru going to Nairobi and telling the Indians that spirit is lost in India today. So, my question today is, and Jairam Ramesh should answer, we the citizens of India elected 4 months ago a new Parliament of India, which according to official calculation, 43% of them are criminals sitting in the Parliament. What is the future of India from that angle? Okay, finish. Now, one comment on this. Power, I'm very happy that our friend mentioned about power. When America entered Vietnam, I was in Vietnam for 1 week at that time. The tricycle fellows taught me a great lesson. In Vietnam, the tricycle fellows. Somebody asked Eisenhower, why are you entering Vietnam? The Eisenhower's answer was, let Asians fight Asians. Eisenhower answered, let Asians fight Asians. That we are doing today. So, my question today is, what do we do for the future of India with 43 criminals in the parliament? Mr. Ramesh, I want to know.
Sir, but that's got nothing to do with foreign policy.
Okay, I think I answered that.
Indians will fight Indians.
I think I answered that, when I made my introductory remarks. I said that if we had also covered the important countries in the Southern Hemisphere, it would have run into several volumes. It's already 300 odd pages now, and that deals with really about a dozen countries. So it was just, it's a task for the future. but we also have said in this book we don't think this is the last word. If it's the first word, we'd be very happy.
Mr. Srinivasan, I wonder if you. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I wanted to ask you to expand on the conclusion of your chapter in your book, The Values in Foreign Policy. Forward-looking question about strategy, Indian foreign policy. If I could just read the last couple sentences, they go, India will engage in strategic and transactional partnerships where its political and economic gains are evident, but the nature of its aspirations remains potentially adverse to its greater integration with the global system. These two aspects will remain the dominant values in Indian foreign policy, irrespective of whichever party is elected to form the government in New Delhi. If you could maybe expand on that.
Yeah, very briefly, because I'm sure there are other people who want to ask questions. Very briefly, I think my view was that there are certain threads in Indian foreign policy which show continuity. As Mr. Jairam Ramesh mentioned, one of those is the sense of exceptionalism. That is to say, you have exceptional characteristics which other countries don't have. Allied with that was the sense of being a guru to the rest of the world. People like Vivekananda and Sarojini Naidu, in fact, said this more or less explicitly before our independence, that India will teach the rest of the world how to live when we become independent. I mean, there was no concealing this fact. That is also a sense of exceptionalism that continues to this day, much more strongly emphasized by the present government. And when you say the world is one family, I mean, this is, of course, contradictory, because you can't say the world is one family and then you say you're going to be a teacher to the rest of the world and you have exceptional characteristics. So this fundamental contradiction makes it very difficult for India to be a good partner in international relations, whether it's in the question of strategic partner with whichever country you want to name, United States, Russia, whatever, or economically. This is why we've always had problems in the WTO. We're going to have problems with the RCEP, which was mentioned earlier. We are the only holdout. There is no, all the other countries in the RCEP have agreed. They're waiting for India. Now, I can well understand their frustration, because this unique characteristic of a high moral plane combined with exceptionalism has always been a hindrance in India's absorption in the international community.
You know, two phrases have become more frequently used in the last 5 years. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Yeah. You can't meet anybody in the establishment who doesn't start a foreign policy debate without saying Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. World is a family. But at the end, they will say Vishwaguru. This word Vishwaguru, I had never heard before in Parliament. But now no session goes without somebody or others getting up and saying, we are the Vishwagurus to the world. So this basically substantiates the last paragraph of what Mr. Srinivasan has written. So this is going to accentuate in the future.
I just have one question, Sam, 1 second. So do you think that Indira Gandhi then was the epitome of what India's foreign policy should be? Because she was pragmatic, she was smart, she put India's interests first, she broke clearly with the past and embraced, Russia for India's good. What do you say, sir? Yes.
Well, I'm not sure that pragmatism, you've always got the tension between the idealists and the realists. The idealists want the best of possible worlds based on values. The realists feel that you, irrespective of your value structures, you've got to do what is best for yourself, even if it means cutting corners, taking very pragmatic, rather, let us say, non-ideological decisions. Now, if you follow the realist school, then you think of Mrs. Gandhi as being, as you say, a very great leader and having steered India through a difficult time. I personally think that it's not really a question of the one or the other. It is a question of a blend of both. You have to have both ideals and pragmatism. And I think that Mrs. Gandhi really, for all her undoubted merits, did actually move away from Mr. Nehru's idealistic foreign policy to a very great extent. In fact, she pretty well abandoned it. You could say that was due to force of circumstances, but I would say that in her dealings with Cambodia, with the Khmer Rouge, with the Afghan invasion, there was no sense of even a residue of morality or values in that policy.
Beautifully put. Nitin, you wanted to say something?
No, I just wanted to say that, look, 2 points. This question of whether Indira Gandhi was a realist or an idealist or Nehru was a realist, I think it's an academic question which theorists are preoccupied with. In practice, they would be both. In different contexts, at different times, in different circumstances, they would be both. So you could ask whether a certain policy or a certain posture was realist or driven by idealism, but not a broad swath of a person who's lived for 70 years or more, right? So they change it. Second is, in terms of bad prime ministers, I have 2 prime ministers who I would pull as bad ones, Morarji Desai and VP Singh. Other than these 2 guys, most prime ministers I've seen had been, using the best resources they had.
But was VP Singh ever tested on his foreign policy?
VP Singh pulling out the army out of Sri Lanka in a way that he did was just terrible. The scars of Sri Lanka still continue largely because of the way VP Singh pulled them out.
That's why we don't have boots on the ground in Afghanistan.
Well, that's probably one reason, but the scars are still there. The ghosts of IPKF still haunt us.
Sam Arni?
Yeah, I had a question. Nitin had said that millennials are not interested in foreign policy. So since I work with a lot of millennials and I am one myself, I wanted to ask specifically about climate change because that's what the one burning issue for many millennials are. And how will climate change impact our foreign policy? I see a lot of borders shifting, floods happening, refugees coming in, economic interests shifting. And how will ideals and pragmatism have to also be balanced in any discussion of values in foreign policy when it comes to what the consequences of climate change will be?
Well, one of the things that has happened in the last couple of years has been there's been refreshing pragmatism in foreign policy when it comes to climate change. For long, our foreign policy in relation to climate change was predicated on the assumption that we are not responsible for global warming and therefore we have no responsibility for doing anything. And India, the solution for India in any global forum, whenever India is under the lens, is to come up with a per capita metric. Because on a per capita metric, India wins, nothing to beat because the denominator is 1.3 billion and it's increasing by 10 million every year. So anything per capita is very, very low. So per capita emissions, we are amongst the lowest. So ever since the Rio summit, since 1992, the mandarins of the foreign policy establishment had locked India into a position on climate change, which was negative, which was defensive, which was confrontational. But things began to change, and by 2009, the time of the Copenhagen summit, India had become a little more pragmatic. After 2009, things have moved faster because climate change is in evidence, whether it's in terms of coastal erosion, whether it's sea level rise, whether it's the monsoon, whether it's the glaciers, whether it's dry days, wet days. So climate change is no longer an academic debate in this country as it was 10 years ago. It's a day-to-day living reality. And so foreign policy has also responded to that. So we are now refreshingly far more pragmatic in our foreign policy stances when it comes to climate change. And that's why we became party to the Paris summit and we took on obligations which we were not willing to take on in the past. But we have a long way to go. Because both India and China are the 2 obstreperous elements in international climate change negotiations. Because we take the view that we are still a developing country. Huh? Well, the US for a different for a different reason, but India and China have commonality of interest. Both are developing countries. Both have a natural right to pollute because we have not polluted for 150 years, so we have a right to pollute for the next 30 years. And per capita, we are very low. So we have a long way to go before we reach the US or European levels of per capita emissions. So on climate change, as Mr. Srinivasan said, India and China's positions have actually converged. And climate change is one area in which India and China have actually worked out a modus vivendi and worked together in climate change negotiations. But internationally, that's good for both countries. But domestically, that's not a position that is tenable anymore because we are vulnerable. We are amongst the most vulnerable countries in the world, and we have to do things on climate change because it's in our interest, and not because the Americans are telling us or the Europeans are telling us. So foreign policy, this is one area where foreign policy has lagged behind. Foreign policy has been slow to respond, but I think over the next couple of years, as the pressures of climate change begin to become more evident, you will see India becoming far more proactive.
Gentleman to the left.
Yes. How well have we reflected our own wisdom from our own repositories like Krishna in Mahabharata or Chanakya? How well are these values have been reflected in our contemporary foreign policy?
How well is Chanakya represented in our current foreign policy?
I'm afraid I'm a little iconoclastic about this. I know there are many references to Chanakya and so on among Indian writers on foreign policy, claiming there's a direct link between ancient philosophy and contemporary foreign policy. I'm very greatly disinclined to believe this, because none of the persons I've worked with, from Mr. Nehru to the latest one was Mr. Vajpayee, was none of them, to my recollection, ever mentioned the word Chanakya in any of their discussions. So it's okay as rhetoric, but it's really honestly pretty useless to consider the art shastra as being the kind of the lexicon of contemporary politics. I think we really have to forget about all that. And yet you have a point, because I think that the structure of the brilliant policy enunciated so well by Mr. Nehru, I think had strong reflections of Buddhism, Hinduism, and more recent philosophers like Vivekananda. So I think there was this element, but no direct references to Chanakya or any of those almost semi-mythical figures.
One last question.
Okay, so my question is for all the panelists, all the three panelists here. I mean, everyone is talking about India, China, US. Are we negating Russia's role in the middle of all this? Because they have, we have had old relations with Russia, and also what Russia did with American elections, they played ping pong during the last elections. And I'm guessing Stalin is laughing in his grave, what Russia did with American elections. Are we negating Russia's role in the entire global foreign policy vis-a-vis India versus Russia?
Russia has been described as Bangladesh with missiles. So, it's a declining power. It's a nuclear power, it's a missile power, but demographically, the Russians are going to be squeezed over the next 20 years. And they're going to be squeezed pretty badly. So I don't see the Russians occupying the strategic space which they used to till the early 90s. They have a lot of nuisance value, and they are a one commodity economy. One commodity economy, which by 2030, hopefully the world will rid its dependence on this one commodity. And once the world rids its dependence on this one commodity, what are the Russians going to do from an economic point of view? So they are an important player. They are an important player now in the Middle East, thanks to the mistakes of the United States. They are not a big player in Asia. They are still a presence in Central Asia, no doubt about it. They are not present in Latin America. They're not present in Africa. They're certainly not present in East Asia, where Japan far outweighs them. So I would worry more about China really than Russia, frankly.
Mrs. Karnad had a question. Last question.
Should I just, I think I'm at the wrong end of the age spectrum to really ask this question. But several of you have talked about changing demographics, and it seems to me that that gives me hope in a sense, because surely that is the emergence of young people today, is that not going to make a change in the values in foreign policy as they operate in foreign policy in the future? Because who are the people who give one any hope today? It's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, it's Greta Thunberg, it's Sheila Rashid. Why are we not giving them more credit for what they could? I think, Nitin, you sort of dismissed them as having no values. I see just the opposite. Not no values, but...
See, I think if you phrase the question as saying, do the young people of today, are they going to have an influence on foreign policy in general and the kind of values-driven foreign policy in particular? My answer is yes. It will be, because if half the population of a country is below the age of 27, these people are going to express political opinions, and these political opinions will inform the kind of policies which the government will take, right? By fact of being a democracy. Where I have a problem with is putting on the value judgment on those values. Are the young people going to promote greater liberalism, progressive thinking, or are they going to regress and go in for a very strong right-wing populist kind of a mindset? I am not so sure. I'm not sanguine that we know the answer to this. We hope that we'll move towards greater liberalism, but I fear that we won't.
Thank you very much for being a great audience. Thank you, panelists. Thank you. Thank you.